Morning, everybody. So for this class, we're going to be discussing Proverbs, and we're specifically going to be looking at the figure of wisdom in the Bible and also depictions of women specifically in the book of Proverbs, right? And we've got for you two different perspectives on the woman that's represented in the book of Proverbs. So let's begin then, and you'll follow along with me on the PowerPoint, please. So let's begin with this quote from Audre Lorde. What woman here is so enamored of her own oppression that she cannot see her heel print upon another woman's face, right? So obviously Lorde is pointing out the fact that women in society, right, have often been pitted against each other. And we've talked about this previously in the trope of woman versus woman, right? If we're looking back in Genesis, we can see that in which characters, right? I want you to think back. We can see that in Sarah and Hagar. We can also see that in Leah and Rachel, the sisters that were both married and vying for the affection and attention of their husband, right? So thinking about the ways in which these representations of women being pitted against each other have often played out in society, and why, right? Why women would want to be in competition rather than in support of each other. So we'll think a little bit about that today, but I want us now briefly to reflect on a woman in your life who you would consider wise, strong, and exemplary, right? This woman in Proverbs 31, especially according to Melanie Chitwood, is a woman to be revered, right? So who is a woman in your life that you can say, I really look up to this woman, and why? So just take a moment and reflect on who that woman is for you. Maybe even give thanks to her, right? I mean, possibly reach out to her and give her a call, send her a text message, and let her know that you're thankful for her today. What I want to do is move through now to an exercise that we would be doing in class. And since we're not actually meeting in class this week, this is something just more for you guys' reflection. As you'll notice on the next slide, this activity is called Act Like a Boy, Act Like a Girl. And one of the things that I want you to think about is this. If there were an alien coming to our society, right, that had to learn how to fit in, or the word that we've used in the past is how to pass, right? What would they have to do in order to act like a boy or act like a girl? So what this is getting us to think about then is, what are the norms, the roles, what are the characteristics, right, that help us to identify someone as either a girl or a boy, as a woman or a man. Right? In the last class, we talked a little bit about anorexia with that Amy Lambert essay, and the ways in which certain expectations are placed, right? Specifically through social media and through images that are produced, certain expectations are put on different genders. So I want us to think then about what you were told, right, about being a boy or being a girl when you were growing up, right? Often students will say that it was okay for them to cry if they were a little girl, but as little boys, most of my male students say that they were told boys don't cry, right? So I want us to think about how then we learned, or in some sense, we're socialized to be our gender, right? So thinking about gender as a social construct, not just something that we essentially are, right? But how did we learn to be, right? So do these kind of things, these different characteristics of what it is to be a boy or a girl, a man or a woman, do they seem natural? Right? In what ways are some of them not necessarily natural to you, right? And you can see some of the questions that I've asked. Are there ways that they can be unlearned? How? What are the costs of stepping outside of your gender role or script, right? If women are traditionally supposed to be more passive, when a woman is dominant, what happens, right? As we saw, I think in the case of the last election with Hillary Clinton, right? When she was so dominant, right, and so outspoken, she was called names, right? Even the B word, right? I mean, women who are stronger in character are often seen as being out of the norm. And so really just thinking about those different ways that we learn about gender roles and how often sometimes they might actually restrict us. If you look to the next slide, I actually have a slide on socialization and how we learn the things that we know. So socialization is our systemic training to the norms of our culture, right? We get trained as babies. We come in and we're pretty much sponges, right? So there's a process of learning meanings and practices and roles, right? We learn about gender, we learn our religion, right? We learn our culture, what it is to be our race. These enable us then to make sense of and behave appropriately within our culture, right? And if we don't do a good job of being socialized or conditioned in the culture, it becomes more difficult to be a part of that culture because we're seen as abnormal, an outlier. Often those who are not a part of the dominant structure, the dominant class, dominant race, right, are seen are often marginalized, even a part of the dominant religion, right? So I want you to look then at this iceberg concept of culture, which sort of shows us there's surface culture, there's shallow culture, and there's deep culture. And if you'll notice, right, surface culture is the most easily seen things. There's a lower emotional level. So this is what foods you eat, how you dress, the music you listen to, virtual arts, drama, crafts, dance, literature, right? So that's, again, the more superficial elements. But then as we move down and go below the surface of the water on this iceberg, we see that these are the norms that we learn that are unspoken rules, right? That we just learn how to, body language, what kind of touching is appropriate, what kind of eye contact or patterns of handling emotions. Those are all cultural things that we learn. And then it moves on down to deep culture, which are attitudes towards dependence, problem solving, roles and relationships, with relation to age, sex, class, occupation, right? It goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And so I want us to think about that in light of what we're seeing in terms of the Proverbs 31 woman, right? And specifically how we understand in Western European culture, right? Because we all operate in America, right? In our culture, what does it mean to be a man or a woman, and how does that look differently also from other cultures? One of the things that has happened as a result of these gender norms, and specifically, right, that men are encouraged often to be strong and dominant and to repress emotions, while women are allowed to express emotions, is that often when those emotions are repressed, it leads people to act out. Then at times it leads them to act out in violence. If we were together, we'd be able to sort of grapple with this a little bit more. Instead, I want you to think about this on your own. If you'll head to the next slide, Nazanin Boniadi said, "Women and girls, men and boys, all share the right to live free of violence, which is unfortunately experienced by both men and women. Women and girls, however, disproportionately experience violence due to a deeply rooted global culture of gender discrimination." Right? So there's a way in which, whether it's physical expressions of violence or emotional and even implicit expressions of violence, because of how there has been a hierarchy set up according to gender, and because of the expectations that are placed on men and those placed on women, there's been a culture of violence that has been accepted globally with regards to gender discrimination. And so I want us to think then about how violence is the exertion of any sort of physical force or behavior that damages, hurts, or destroys someone or something, right? And so I want us to think through then how our culture has been in some ways perpetuating violence around gender, right? And we'll talk about this too as the semester goes on around other things like race, and we've already talked about some of it in terms of class, right? When we saw the Dalit in India who were being abused physically, they were experiencing violence because of the caste system. But thinking then about violence against women, I want you to head to this next slide, and I just have some statistics on this next slide that I want us to think about in terms of domestic violence. How many women, 1 in 4, experience domestic violence? And then you can look at those statistics and see how many women have reported being victimized by an intimate partner. You can see the numbers of women that have actually died from it. And so one of the things we talked about in our last class was the way in which the Bible has been used to hurt and healing. This has continued to come up, right? But the ambivalence of the Bible, right? The fact that it's been used for good and also to hurt people. And so to think about the ways in which the texts that we read for today in Proverbs might hurt and also heal, right? According to how they're being interpreted. Historically, heading to this next slide, men have held positions of authority in the government, church, business, higher education, healthcare, etc., and therefore their perspective was the only one that mattered, right? They were the only voices that were there, that were acknowledged. Theirs was the only agency. So that then their opinions very easily translated or materialized into laws, into our sacred text, right? We've discussed that the Bible was written primarily by men because they were the only ones that, solely because they were the only ones that could read and write at the time, right? They were the only ones allowed to be literate, right? Women were not given this opportunity. And so there's also an influence in media, athletics, academics. So it's interesting to think about then, right? With men having such a tremendous amount of power, what kind of result would there be on a global level and also a societal level if men recognize their important role in this issue, right? Like, what if we didn't just see violence against women as a women's issue, but what if we saw it as a men's issue? Men taking responsibility, men caring for women, men seeing women as equally valuable, necessary, and really as their equals, and understood their important role in stepping up and stopping violence against women, right? What women deserve is always tied to their relationships to men, right? We have to think about how society has, since biblical times, how women's value has often been connected to the men that they've been in a relationship to, while men are not seen in the same way, right? And we've got to think about how that affects human beings, right? And do we believe that that's a structure that is God ordained, or is that something that happened because of patriarchy within society, and in some ways misogyny, right? Repression or suppression of women's power, agency, and women's voices, right? I want us to turn to the next screen. And when we look at next slide, when we look at women in the ancient Mediterranean, right, they were often objectified, sexualized, exoticized, and they were often depicted as one-dimensional, right? So they weren't seen as having agency, so they were represented as either one thing or another. So when we get to and then they would personify sort of these desirable or undesirable traits. So then when we get to Proverbs, then we see that the woman wisdom in Proverbs, right? Wisdom is personified as a woman. We also see in the text that you guys read for today that there's also another woman, right? The woman wisdom is juxtaposed with this strange woman, this wayward woman that could potentially lead men astray. Well, this is important to think about because, and head to this next slide, what we know about wisdom in the Bible, right, and Proverbs is that it was used to train young men. Right, it was older men training young men. As I said before, right, young men at this time were the only ones that were able to go through school. They were the only ones that were literate. And so men would train young men in the way they should go, in the way of wisdom. And so wisdom was personified as a woman over and against this sort of prostitute-like strange woman who can lead you astray, lead you off the path of wisdom. So continue on this path of wisdom and this path of socialization and enculturation into our society, into our culture, into our traditions, right? So as we know, the Bible is a composite of all these different oral traditions, right? We've talked about the world behind, right? When a lot of this was actually finally composed, it was over, centuries, but we see that these stories were being written down in the 6th century and after. So again, then thinking about what we're seeing as we turn to wisdom, right? I also want us to now think about, and we'll move into a discussion of these essays for today, right? The Brenner essay and the Chitwood essay, right? All the while sort of thinking about the ways in which women are being depicted in this text and how they're one-dimensional. You'll also see there's a slide, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in my discussion of the essays, but you'll also see there's a slide from Housekeeping Monthly, and this was obviously, this is back in the 1950s, right? But we see in some ways how there could be a parallel between the expectations of the good wife, or this housekeeping weekly depiction of the good wife's guide and what a good wife does, and the ways in which the woman in Proverbs is represented, right? And then I'll let you guys kind of take a look at that, and we'll discuss a few of these as we look at the essays. So stay tuned for, or I guess now, watch the essay videos as I talk through them.